All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined by Karlo Broussard, returning guest. He's been on the show several times, both the old podcast and this new one. Karlo, great to have you back. Thanks for being here, my friend. How are you doing?
Pat, thanks for having me, brother. It's great to be with you. I'm doing
Yeah,
okay, man. Hanging in there.
good, dude. Well, we're actually gonna talk about philosophy and Catholicism and offer some philosophical considerations for Catholicism and talk about some of the new work you've been doing. No formal agenda. This is just gonna kind of be shoot from the hip and see what comes out of it. I know when I talk to Karlo, which we do sort of fairly often behind the scenes, we just hop on the horn and catch up. It's always very fruitful. So I'm sure this will be as well. But before that, Karlo, it's been a while since you've actually been on the show. So if you don't mind, maybe just give another introduction, a reintroduction, if you will, and update us on some of the stuff you've been working on. What's new in your world?
Well, what's new is that I'm working on my PhD in philosophy under the direction of Dr. Gavin Kerr for my dissertation on divine immutability and the variability of creation, which you have a great interest in, right? And I'm sure a lot of your viewers and listeners do as well. So that's new. Been working on my dissertation, over halfway done. Got a couple of chapters to go, right? Roughly around 20,000 words. So I'm looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm.
20,000 words to go, that is, not the total amount.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
Also, got the brand new book out that just came out, Meeting the Protestant Response, How to Answer Common Comebacks to Catholic Arguments. And so having a lot of fun with that, doing a lot of interviews for the book. I just completed a manuscript for my 5th book, hopefully, that will be published here at Catholic Answers Press. The idea is relative absolutism. So rather than the old approach where we expose the where we expose the absolutism of relativism, showing that relativism is just an absolute claim, right,
Mm-hmm.
about reality. This approach exposes the relativism embedded in and behind cultural modern absolutes.
Yeah, I know what you're coming at. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah. So there's a claim both within Christian and non-Christian circles that relativism is dead, and that's old apologetics. But what I'm claiming in this manuscript and hopefully forthcoming book is that relativism is actually not dead. That even though it is true, we have this sort of new moral absolutism and the shame culture and a variety of modern thou shalt nots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thou shalt not be intolerant. Thou shalt not be a white supremacist, and on down the line. When you scratch the surface or you pull back the veil and you think about it a little bit more, what's being said in the verbiage of the absolute, actually what's behind it is relativistic thinking. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just age-old relativism that's just camouflaged in absolute terminology. And so part of the purpose of that manuscript is to expose that relativism, to show that it's actually a relative absolute claim.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, to refute the modern absolute and refute the relativistic embedded in it. So I don't know what you think about that, but I'm trying to make a pitch to our marketing department here to publish such a book. So hopefully they'll accept that, and we'll come out with that book maybe fall of 23.
Well, I think it's great. And hey, marketing department, I'd love to have a chance to have Karlo back on to talk about it. So go ahead and send him the contract. We'll appreciate it. Yeah,
I'm gonna put that in my notes, man.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's awesome. You're always doing cool, good work, and we'll talk about some of the content, I'm sure, in your most recent book, and we'll mention that more at the end. I wanted to explore with you, Karlo, some of the philosophical considerations for Catholicism, because I think we're both. Remind me, you are a convert, right? You were. What was
I am not.
You were not. Okay,
Nope.
all right. So
I'm a Catholic from the cradle, baby.
All right, that's right. I get all you Catholic Answers people mixed up. Some of you are converts, some of you Cradle Catholics. Yep.
I'm a boring old Cradle Catholic, man.
Great, that's good. We need because there's kind of this because I'm a convert and Jimmy's the convert. That's right. So I get you guys.
Tim's convert.
Trent's convert, right? And there's this kind of cliche that like, hey, converts make the best apologists, whatever. I don't think that's true. I think there's a ton of people like you, Karlo, who were Cradle Catholics, and maybe you have like a deepening of your faith or deep spiritual significance that are out there just doing such good work. Help us break that myth up. Is that a myth, Karlo?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, yeah, it is a myth. Just because you're a convert doesn't make you a good apologist, or just
Mhm,
because you're a Cradle Catholic doesn't make you a bad apologist, right?
mhm.
We can affirm either of those propositions. It is true that there is a sense in which converts do appreciate the apologetical dimension of our faith because they've had to wrestle with
Yeah.
those issues in ways that many of us as Cradle Catholics have not wrestled with those issues. So I think it's fair to say that for converts, there does seem to be at least an initial greater appreciation for those obstacles that have to be overcome in order to assent to the truth of the Catholic faith. However, for us as Cradle Catholics, like for me, it was it. I can come to appreciate the obstacles, but just in a different way because I'm approaching the obstacles from a different perspective. I've
Mhm.
never really personally struggled with some of the questions that maybe you have had, but when I come across the question in my research or in my just my own thinking, it's interesting questions that I have to pursue and try to find reasonable answers to,
Mhm.
and certain obstacles that you may have considered as an obstacle, but for me, it's more of an intellectual puzzle, right?
Mhm.
To try and overcome, as opposed to having that emotional experience and response to like, holy cow, if I don't answer this question right, I'm in like this dilemma, this existential crisis or something.
Yeah.
So although I've been able to, and I think for us as Cradle Catholics can appreciate those questions as just appreciating it in a different way than say somebody coming from the other side has to appreciate it.
Yeah.
And it is true that for somebody who's not involved in apologetics, they're not going to consider certain aspects of the faith,
Sure.
certain questions that you as a
Mhm.
convert would have considered, because Cradle Catholics simply don't come across those questions very often unless they're like diving in to theology and philosophy and
Mhm.
listening to all these sorts of podcasts.
Yeah, excellent. So, okay, so I'm gonna now approach this a little bit differently because I was under the false assumption of you being a convert, but it's not going to change the conversation much. But here's what I'm thinking, Carlo. I wanna ask you how you think philosophy can support the Catholic faith, and here's what I mean by that. I don't think, maybe you're different. I don't think that you can just from the armchair through deep philosophical reflection and argument prove the Catholic faith. I don't think that's true. However, I think through good philosophy, philosophy of God and metaphysics, philosophical anthropology, epistemology, especially the nature of epistemic authority, put a lot of philosophical considerations that point in the direction of Catholicism, that make a strong cumulative case for it, and can kind of set you up with a strong set of background beliefs that then will help you interpret certain data that might otherwise seem to be able to spill in a number of different directions, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So if you catch what I'm saying here, I'd like to just push that all over to you and have you comment on it, and we'll build the conversation up from there. Because I don't want to. I've talked about this a million times on my channel, but I don't want to set the agenda for this conversation. I want to just get your thoughts on this totally fresh, if that makes sense. Mhm.
Yeah, well, first of all, philosophy is going to play a role in helping a person analyze the alleged revelation, right? So if there are certain things that we can come to know to be true by reason alone, through philosophical analysis, metaphysical demonstrations concerning God's existence, certain divine attributes of God, then that's going to help us analyze and discern whether an alleged revelation is going to be at least compatible with what we already know to be true and whether it's going to conflict with it. So if I come across an alleged revelation that's going to conflict and contradict that which I know to be metaphysically true by reason alone, and not just probably true, but through metaphysical demonstration, then I know that alleged revelation is going to be false,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
So if I come across an alleged revelation that says God can change, then I'm going to know that revelation is false. Or God in God's very divine nature is corporeal, then I'm going to know that alleged revelation is false, because I've already established philosophically that God in his divine nature cannot change. God is not corporeal in the divine essence, or the very being of divinity. The essence of divine being is not corporeal. So that philosophical analysis is going to help me discern at least what cannot be true revelation, right? And then also helping me to see a revelation that, even if not conflicting, at least is consistent with it, and very likely to be even probably true. Not definitively true, because as you said, philosophy cannot demonstrate something that's going to be supernaturally, divinely revealed, but at least it can provide some grounds to show that it's likely true. So here's one thought that comes to mind, in the work that I've done with Father Robert J. Spitzer at the Maggia Center. One line of thinking that he takes, which I find is something worth thinking about, is once we establish that God in his very essence is pure love itself, right? Because he is the pure actuality, pure being. He perfectly loves himself. Once you understand of God's pure goodness and pure love, it's at least reasonable to think that he would want to communicate such goodness and love, and manifest himself to creatures. So it's reasonable, given a prior metaphysics of divinity, that God would reveal himself, say through Jesus Christ. So there's sort of a philosophical preamble that at least tees up the fittingness of a self-revelation of the Almighty through a figure, say, like Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. No, finish your thought and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, so that's one approach where philosophy can come into play to show a likelihood of the revelation of Jesus Christ. And then particularly with Catholicism, given our philosophical analysis of how God relates to human beings according to the nature that he created them with, we can take that principle. Once we establish revelation of Jesus Christ, and we're talking about his establishment of a church, we're presented with a variety of options of how Christ willed for that church to operate. Some Christians will say that he gave us this revelation, all these revealed supernatural truths, but that it's codified strictly in writing, and that there is no infallible testimony or custodian of that revelation to authentically interpret that revelation. That's one Christian narrative. Then you have another narrative presented by Christians, say Catholics, that Christ gives us all of this supernatural revelation stuff about God, and that he did establish an infallible testimony, not just in the writings, but also a living voice that would be a custodian of that revelation, to provide an authentic interpretation of that revelation, to preserve that revelation from error. And that's what we call the magisterium, right? The official teaching authority of the Catholic Church, the Pope and the bishops united with the Pope. Now, when we have those two positions before us, we can use philosophy and philosophical analysis to say, well, which of these two narratives comports best with how we know God relates to us as human beings, given our human nature. And once we understand that, and we have that in place, that given our human nature, we need to be able to have a human being to settle disputes for us. We need a final principle of authority, just like we need a first cause to explain why something is rather than nothing. It's fitting that there would be a first principle in virtue of which we can know what is authentic interpretation of divine revelation, as opposed to what is not authentic interpretation of divine revelation. So that sort of philosophical analysis can help us discern that it's most likely that the Catholic narrative or the Catholic view of these things is going to be the right view. And then, of course, we would look to the historical evidence to justify that claim definitively. But at least the philosophy allows for us to see which of these two views most likely be the right view.
Yeah, that's really good. And so let me echo a few of the points that you said and try and break it into, I guess, two stages, right? The first stage is what sort of philosophical considerations do we have that there would be revelation? That's the first stage, right? And you laid out a lot of good stuff there. So maybe we have philosophy of God, and we do our fancy metaphysics, right? And we get to God as pure actuality and pure goodness, and this principle of self-diffusiveness and the Dionysian principle, all these metaphysical principles I know all my listeners are totally familiar with, right?
Yeah.
And this gives us an expectation in relation to the facts that something seems to have either gone wrong in this world, or that revelation would be important for our ultimate end, that we could expect actually some sort of supernatural inbreaking, if you will, some sort of revelation. And there might be further considerations that even might indicative of something like an incarnation and atonement. And philosophers do push that through considerations, again, of the nature of goodness, how goodness not only seeks to draw things to itself, but to seek a unity with its beloved, right? And I mean, like, it's hard to beat the incarnation on, right. on that front, right? So I think you're right. I think we can get like strong philosophical considerations that set us up for revelation. And I think let me be careful. It doesn't deductively prove this, right?
Right.
But I think strongly sets up an expectation for something like incarnation atonement, if you want. And by no means these arguments are not original to me.
It shows a fittingness, right?
A strong fittingness, right?
Yeah.
The fact that you see those claims be made historically fits really well with the prior philosophical expectations. That gives you all the more reason to think that this is the correct story, is what I'm trying to say, right?
Right.
And then you have the considerations, many, I think, philosophically, of how that revelation might be transmitted, preserved, interpreted, spread, all that. Do you think that's helpful to break it down into those two buckets, right? Because one might just get you a sort of broad Christianity. The other is, well, which form?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on in framing it that way, of that which provides an expectation of a supernatural revelation itself, but then moving forward, what would be most fitting for us as human beings, given our fallibility, right? And the fact that we can mess things up, that moving forward, what would be the best way of preserving and communicating that divine revelation. Another thought that came to mind is another way in which philosophy serves Catholicism is that it provides for us a way in which we're able to expose objections, the flaws of objections to the faith, right? So not only in serving it in the way that we've articulated so far, of sort of preparing for revelation, best way of preserving revelation, but also for us as Catholics in particular, of showing why objections fail with regard to refuting certain Catholic arguments or certain Catholic beliefs. So we're often using philosophy to expose the flaws in objections in order to answer the objections. So philosophy provides a defensive role of what we profess to be divinely revealed as well. Mm-hmm. And whenever you're able to show how many, if not all, objections to what we propose to be divinely revealed fail, and then you have supporting evidence for the revelation itself, well, then you have a strong case for that divine revelation.
Right. And we can use philosophy not just to interrogate the Catholic paradigm, but other paradigms as well. And this was a case for me. And let me just make the disclaimer. We've got many listeners from many different backgrounds, atheist, Protestant. Love all you guys. I'm Catholic. I think it's true. And so I'm trying to explain why I came to that decision. And when I look at Protestantism, there's a number of, to my mind, philosophical problems with Protestantism. And these I don't think they get drawn out enough. And part of this is my bias, because that's the background I come from. I didn't come from a religious or Christian background. I came from a philosophical background. So I just tend to look at things primarily through that paradigm.
Yeah.
And some of these problems concern problems of authority and epistemic authority. I mean, you have your classic issues with sola scriptura, and the fundamental issue with the stronger forms of sola scriptura, to me, Karlo, seems to be almost a straightforward contradiction, where in one sense the church cannot dogmatically define anything that isn't deduced from Scripture, yet the church must dogmatically define something that can't be deduced from Scripture, which is the canon, right? So like that to me was like a big problem up front as I was looking into the Protestant paradigm. Sure. Questions of authority, determining essential matters, interpreting practical affairs, practical disciplines, that pretty quickly, it just didn't seem like that paradigm fit with what I would expect if God to reveal something.
Right.
And then when you have the Catholic paradigm, it also seems sort of radically individualistic in a way that doesn't quite accord with human anthropology.
Right.
I mean, philosophical anthropology, right? That we are not just rational animals, but we're rational, social dependent animals. We depend on, require testimony, tradition, institution. We are
Yeah.
deeply interdependent beings, not just for our existence, but our knowledge, our beliefs, all of that. And then when you link that back to other principles that we haven't defended, but I think are that come out in a good philosophical analysis, like essentialism and the principle that God doesn't just create, he governs, and he governs things according to their nature, right?
Sure.
Then I think we would start to get these expectations that if God's going to reveal something, he's going to do it in a way that's harmonious with human nature, harmonious with the way that we normally come to knowledge and form beliefs. So now we're starting to think about, the importance and the necessity of things like testimony and institution and authority. But then you sort of have this greater expectation of, well, if these things are really, really important, which if it's revelation, it sort of has to be, right? Essentially on the essential matters of faith and morals, you kind of, I think, can. And some people might think might just be complete ad hoc rationalization, but I don't think it is. That there would be some sort of guardrails in place, right? To make sure that the really essential important stuff doesn't go completely off the rails or becomes impossible to discern. And so this is where we start getting towards something very, very close to the doctrine of indefectibility, which extends to infallibility. So I just put a bunch of stuff half baked on the table for you, Karlo, but I want you to put it in the oven and finish the recipe here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think you hit on an important point that God's going to govern us supernaturally in a way that comports with how he governs us naturally, right? Because when we're talking about Jesus and supernatural revelation stuff, right? When we're talking about the church and authority and church teaching, we're talking primarily about supernatural stuff that Jesus has communicated to us, that we claim Jesus has communicated to us from Almighty God, because we profess that he is God made flesh. But it's fitting and it's appropriate that God would govern us on a supernatural level in a way that's consistent with how he governs us on a natural level. So just think of the need for us as rational, social, interdependent animals, right? That as rational animals, we live within society, and that even according to natural law principles, there's going to be a need for one to govern that society, right? We see it primarily intimately in the family, where there's going to be a principle of headship in order to properly order the members of that small society, the society of the family that the family is.
And for those of my listeners who are following us on Aristotle's Politics, we're pretty much right on that at this point.
Okay,
right?
cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you extend that society to the broader society, where you have a collection of families, and there's going to be a need that serves a need for a principle in virtue of which those families that constitute the larger society can be properly unified and ordered to the common end of the perfection of the members of that society. And of course, that requires a governor, someone to oversee that movement, that proper ordering. And of course, philosophically, we're able to argue that, the ultimate authority and governor is God himself, but he does that in and through secondary causes, right? Governors of these larger and smaller societies. So if God does that on a natural level, well, then how much more would he do it on a supernatural level? That if he's going to create this supernatural society that's going to involve members here on earth, but who are operating, thinking, acting in supernatural ways, dealing with supernatural stuff, that he would have a principle in virtue of which these members of the supernatural society can be unified and governed in a way that's directed to a common end or goal, union with Christ, by a governor here on earth. And so the Catholic paradigm of having that visible principle in virtue of which members of Christ's church can be united, looked after, governed, and directed to the common end of union with Christ, that paradigm maps on with what we know God does with us on a natural level. And think about this too, Pat. This thought just occurred to me. This doesn't apply only with regard to governance with respect to like teaching and authority and God's revelation, but this principle also applies with the traditional Christian understanding of the sacramental principle. Like, so we have these things called sacraments, right?
Right.
Where like baptism and Eucharist, where we're taking the Holy Eucharist and feeding our soul, and confirmation, all of these different things that maps on to how God governs us on a natural level. So we are born, then we are fed and provided nutrients. Why? To keep the natural life alive. We grow in our natural life as we strengthen. We are strengthened, right? We fall ill, then we are healed. Well, that's a sort of a natural governance of the natural life by God. And so on a supernatural level, it's fitting that God would do the same, just in a supernatural way. So we are reborn through baptism. We are the life, a supernatural life that God gives us through that new supernatural birth is nourished through the Holy Eucharist. It is strengthened through the sacrament of confirmation. When it becomes sick or even dies, it is healed or resurrected through the sacrament of reconciliation or confession. So I bring that up just to illustrate the Catholic understanding of how the way in which God relates to us and works in and through and with us on the natural level provides for us a ground to see how God very likely would relate to us and work with us and through us on a supernatural level. And that's the Catholic paradigm.
Right. Yeah, that's really good, Karlo. I hadn't heard that thought of that last one before. So that's all new fodder for me. All right, so let's move now towards the papacy in particular. Let me ask you a couple of questions about it. One is, there's been a lot of debate about this recently. I think a lot of sort of fruitful debate in the online apologetic world on all sides. And a lot of that debate seems to have come down upon people on largely on the Protestant side coming to recognize, hey, I can't evaluate every Catholic claim, every doctrine, every dogma individually, right? They realize that's a problem because what human could possibly do that, right? There's a lot there. Granted, there's a lot there. However, I think that's sort of what, in a sense, that's almost what Protestantism demands, right? Because if you're going to sort of be part of the right congregation, you have to make sure that that congregation has got scripture right, which means you have to evaluate the doctrine of those congregations, the scripture. So like, if you don't think that that's a reasonable demand to evaluate Catholicism, you should turn that back and ask if that's what you're expected to do as a Protestant. And if that's just not a reasonable demand in general, there's got to be some other demand. I don't think you can get away without any demands on a person. I just think that what the Catholic paradigm demands of even the layperson is significantly lighter if you're trying to be consistent with the paradigms than what Protestantism demands. Anyway, all that said, I think a lot of people have realized that if I'm going to try and evaluate the Catholic paradigm, I should really look into this papacy thing because it seems like pretty central, right? If there is good basis for the papacy and supremacy and authority, and I can affirm that, which is, again, I think an extension really of indefectibility, then it seems like I would just have good reason to kind of just accept the rest, right? Kind of as a package deal. Do you think that is the right way to think about it? Do you think that's the best way to think about it? I'm asking for, I know we have a lot of listeners that are very interested Protestants.
Right.
So give us some comments on that, and then maybe we could talk about the papacy a little bit more specifically. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think so, because if the proper authority is in place, I mean, think about this, Pat. If I can establish that Jesus is God made flesh, he claimed to be God, those claims are historically verifiable, he rose from the dead to vindicate those claims. If I have that in place, then I can believe whatever Jesus says, right? I mean, I don't have to take what Jesus says and analyze every single thing. I have reason to trust what he says, even without scrutinizing what he says once I've established the legitimacy of his authority, because the truth of what he says is going to follow from the fact that he is God made flesh. And I think the same line of reasoning applies to the Catholic Church. If Peter, and by way of extension, his successors in the bishopric of Rome, have this unique role to play within this community we call the church, established by Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church, we would claim and argue as Catholics, well, then one would be within right reason to rely on that testimony of what the successors to St. Peter say, at least when it comes to definitive matters, like when the Pope or the bishops in union with the Pope, this living teaching authority is going to say, hey, we got to believe this thing, and it's true, and it ain't going to change, and this is binding for us in order to get to heaven. Then based on the authority that they have to speak on behalf of Christ, it would be within the boundaries of right reason to assent to that, even though we have not come to that conclusion on our own. And even before we analyze the teaching to think, well, I have to analyze it before I can assent. No, I already have a foundation in virtue of which I can reasonably assent. And by no means is that assent a blind impulse of the mind, because I already have that strong foundation in virtue of which I can assent to this testimony, because I have reason to think this testimony is given to us by Jesus Christ, whose testimony is legit as well. And so I do think that it provides us a lighter load. Absolutely. Once we have the authority of the church in place, then I have reason to assent to what the church teaches me. And then, of course, this gets to the famous dictum of faith seeking understanding. The faith that we have first, the belief that we have first in the teaching of the church, is by no means blind. It is grounded in reason based upon the historical evidence, but we believe first, and then we can seek to understand. And that's what we call theology, where we take reason and have reason bear on that which we've already taken to be divinely revealed or truth itself, and begin to penetrate in our understanding of that which we first assent to with belief. And of course, that belief is just like any belief. You believe that the can of nuts has nuts in the can in the grocery store based upon the testimony of the company that put the label on the can. That's a natural belief. Religious, supernatural belief is believing on the testimony of Jesus Christ and those whom he divinely appointed to speak on his behalf. That's what we call supernatural religious faith.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. And just to circle back, when I say that nobody gets off of having any burden, even laymen, I still think that if you're evaluating these different paradigms in Catholicism, you still have to try and make some effort to see if there is a church in historical continuity, right, with the church that Christ founded. So I just want to make it sure, Catholics aren't completely off the hook. It's not like they don't have to do any work, and we're trying to do some of the work here, both with the background philosophical analysis. And then we might get into some of the historical facts as well. Go ahead, Karlo.
Yeah, and this gets to what I said earlier. So as a Catholic, we would have the historical foundation for the legitimacy of the Catholic Church and its claims to be speaking on behalf of Christ, which would justify me assenting to those teachings, but then applying philosophy to penetrate our understanding of those teachings, as well as defend those teachings against objections. Because when objections are posed to those teachings, we're going to have to use philosophy in order to identify where the flaws lie in the objection to show that it does not succeed as undermining a particular Catholic belief that we have. Now, there was one other thought that occurred to me as you were talking, Pat, that I wanted to share. I suppose that a non-Catholic, just somebody who's approaching Christianity for the first time, talking about, have the burden of trying to show that, well, yeah, this thing seems true and therefore I can assent. I do agree that without a living testimony to speak on behalf of Christ, it's going to be harder. And there does seem to be a need to have to verify everything that's being claimed. But I think there is some room for a Protestant for a non-Catholic to legitimately investigate the claims of Christianity in a general way and come to a position that would justify at least assent to Jesus Christ without a living teaching authority, right? Because the historical evidence of Jesus and his teachings and what these Christians are claiming about Jesus's teaching does provide sufficient evidence for someone to at least assent to Jesus and say, yeah, I'm going to be a Christian in the sense that I'm going to follow this Jesus dude, right? I think he's God and he died on the cross and he rose from the dead, so I can give him my assent.
Yeah, they're in C.S. Lewis's hallway for those who've read Mere Christianity, right?
That's right. That's right. So, but then the questions are going to come up to where, okay, well, I got this teaching from Jesus that I'm not quite certain about. And so how do I settle that dispute? And you got competing views about what Jesus taught. So how do I settle that dispute and that inquiry? And that's where the need of a living testimony to speak on behalf of Christ comes into play, that would not be restricted to the confines of a written document, but a living voice that can address issues that arise that may not be present in the written documents and texts, but a living voice that could help us discern truth from error in issues that arise outside of those written texts that the early Christians were not addressing primarily, and applying what is revealed to contemporary issues in a way that stays true to the divine revelation.
Right. Excellent. I don't know if you've read the paper yet. It's a new one. It's from Dr. Joshua Sijuwati. He's been on this show, and he makes in a similar, it's not exactly the considerations we're making, but there's strong similarities of the philosophical case for the papacy. And he says, yeah, that the sort of a priori case, it can't get you all the way there, but it gets you a good way. And then in conjunction with the historical facts, he thinks that finishes the job. And he's saying that himself as somebody who converted. But he does think, and I think this is important to bring up, because I think Catholics are divided on this. He thinks you need the philosophical case to finish a job. He thinks the historical details are not enough. Now, I have other friends who definitely disagree with that. Friends that are big into the East-West debates, and they smart, scholarly friends. They think that if you really get into historical weeds, it can finish a job, but it might just finish it by an inch, right? I'd like your thoughts on that. Do you think you need the both and here? I think we both agree that the philosophy alone can't totally do it. But what about just a historical analysis, a scriptural analysis? I'd just like to get your thoughts on all that.
Yeah,
even if you think the both and is better, do you think you could do it just that way? If you know what I mean.
My initial thought is that the historical evidence is sufficient to establish an authority, and a unique authority invested in St. Peter, and by way of extension to his successors, and that in the early church, you do have strong evidence of a recognition by early Christians in the first and the second centuries that the successor to St. Peter as the Bishop of Rome has a unique authority to do what Peter did at the Council of Jerusalem and settle disputes. I mean, we have evidence of Christians appealing to the Church of Rome and understanding that the Church of Rome would have a monarchical bishop, right? A single bishop overseeing that church, that the Church of Rome was viewed to have this unique privilege and authority to settle disputes among other Christians throughout the Christian world. And that paradigm is present there even in the first and second centuries, and of course just intensifies as you extend out from those early centuries, and it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer. But the essentials, in my view, are there present in the first and second centuries, and of course in the New Testament itself. And it would seem to me initially, upon thinking about it, that the philosophical case is going to confirm that which we're seeing in the historical evidence to make the case even stronger. So I would view it as historical evidence providing the grounds in virtue of which I can rationally conclude the Bishop of Rome is the successor to St. Peter, who has the authority that Peter had, thus giving us continuity with the original church established by Jesus, but then having a philosophical case to complement that historical evidence, right? Now, if we're reversing the dialogue and I'm talking to someone who has no idea about Christianity, I would employ a philosophical line of reasoning to initiate the conversation, to try to tee up the historical evidence, to say, here, in light of what we know by reason, it makes sense that there would be such an institution. So now the question, is there such an institution? And then providing the historical evidence. I think the historical evidence suffices to show that there is, in fact, such an institution of the papacy. But I think by way of a pedagogy and teaching moment, it's valuable to use the philosophical case to tee up the historical evidence.
Yeah.
And I think that makes the historical evidence that much more convincing.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. And I want to get a little bit more into the papacy and maybe consider some of the objections you have in your book so people can get a taste of the book here as well. But I just want to, I think, reiterate what we're saying, or at least trying to say. I always wonder if I'm coming off as articulate or not. But I mean, Newman's great. We love Cardinal Newman. At least I do, because when he talks about how we assent to things, it's usually not just one single argument or something like that, right? It's a confluence of different influences and impressions. It's this argument, it's that argument, it's this testimony, it's that experience, it's this intuition, right? All of it kind of pushing in, converging to a particular position. And at some point, the scales just tip and we assent. And that was definitely the case for me and the Catholic faith. When I first started getting really into metaphysics and natural theology, and eventually I became quite convinced of classical theism, right? And that had that sort of winnowing effect that you talked about at the beginning of the conversation. It's like, okay, if there's any true religion, right, it seems to me that it has to affirm this about God, right? So that takes out a lot, not all of them, but it narrows it down. The one thing we didn't bring up were ethical considerations. I mean, I'm definitely of the mind that a sort of natural law is about the only sound ethic, really sound ethic out there, right? So from an ethical perspective, again, if religion is making ethical claims, I would expect them to sort of map on to this as well, right?
I actually thought about that. I almost brought it up earlier, and I'm glad you brought it up, because given what we know through natural law theory and what we can arrive at ethically by reason alone, that's going to provide yet another measuring rod for us to analyze the alleged revelation. So if you have ethical teachings from a particular Christian community that map on more with what we know by reason, or even completely with what we know by reason, that's going to tip the scale in favor of that Christian community, as opposed to another Christian group who's making ethical claims that conflicts with what we know through reason alone. And that would give us reason to think, well, maybe that Christian community and whatever authority is speaking on behalf of that Christian community is not from Jesus Christ, as they're claiming to be. And so I would, as a Catholic, I would use contraception. I know I'm opening up a can of worms there. I would use contraception as an example of that, right? I would argue philosophically, we can know that entails an intrinsic disorder, intrinsic evil, right? The activity is perverse. So if there's a Christian group coming out and saying in a sort of definitive way, right, that we're going to believe as Christians that it is okay, my reason, my philosophical analysis is going to say, that's not comporting with what I know to be reason. And then I have this other church for years consistently proclaiming that it is intrinsically evil. So there's a mapping on of the ethical claim there with what I know to be reason. And of course, that provides this convergence of evidence that, man, this Christian group that's teaching something in conformity with natural law when these other groups are not, gives me reason to assent to what they're teaching, to join that community.
And all the more, I would say, for people who are familiar with the historical context of this, if many of those other groups fall and culture's moving decidedly in a certain direction, but that particular institution stands. And it's that particular institution that claims to be indefectible, right? That's really interesting. That's really, and it was to me, like, as somebody who came from that, like, it's funny you brought up contraception, because that was actually a really interesting one for me, because it was sort of a clear instance of what Catholicism predicted about itself was inaccurate prediction. even though a lot of people in the church really thought the church was going to change her teachings at the time, right?
Right.
And so let me just get out the rest of the considerations, and we'll move back towards the papacy. I mean, again, to me, it was a cumulative case. I think it is a cumulative case. When I think about all the things that I would expect if the Catholic paradigm were true, either the Catholic paradigm itself predicts or philosophical considerations that predict Catholicism, classical theism, natural law, notions of philosophical anthropology and divine governments, epistemology, especially testimony, tradition, institution, all of that hierarchy. But then you just have the whole host of, and I wish that this apologetic branch would get a little bit resuscitated, or the various motives of credibility. You still hear about it a little bit, but I think that they don't get emphasized enough because they did make a big impact to me. The scientifically scrutinized Eucharistic miracle accounts, apparitions, Fatima, just the sheer endurance of the Catholic Church. You have to ask, honestly, would I expect these things to happen if Catholicism weren't true?
Right.
Right.
And
the fact that they have withstood as much scrutiny as they have, would I expect that even if they don't prove it, you have to ask, what is the likelihood of this on the opposite hypothesis? That's how you have to look at it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you consider the figures within Catholic history and how bad they were, and people within the church intentionally trying to destroy the Catholic Church, but yet the Catholic Church still survives despite all of the flaws of its leaders and its members, and it still exists. I mean, that is in and of itself, like you said, a motive of credibility for the supernatural origin of the Catholic Church. Absolutely. And appealing to the miracles, I agree, man. Like when you look at, I mean, granted, we affirm that even God can work miracles outside of the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church, even within Christian and non-Christian communities. So we acknowledge that. But when you look at the type of miracles that are alleged to be real within Catholic history, and you look at the amount and the quantity of those miracles and how solid they are, rooted within reason, like in investigating them. Like it's not just, by golly, my elbow's healed, right?
Well, yeah, so that's important because what you're saying here is it's not just a sort of general miracle of healing or something like that. They are what I would call confirmatory miracles. They're miracles that are confirmatory of particular teachings, right? And it would be problematic if we had, say, Martin Luther having apparitions.
In direct association with his claim that, say, the Pope is not
right. Yeah, he's not saying I made a mistake in the apparition, right? But he's and like to have the equivalent of Fatima with Martin Luther, that would be a problem. But we don't have anything like that. We just don't at all. So that's something I think this isn't emphasized enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a plug here for Father Robert Spitzer. I mentioned him earlier, and I still work with him a bit in helping him put together some of his books. But he's actually going to be coming out with a couple of books that your viewers would be interested in. I'm sure you're going to be interested in. One is Science at the Doorstep of God. So looking at scientific evidence that's converging toward the hypothesis of God, but then also Science at the Doorstep of Christ, looking at, say, the Shroud of Turin, pointing in the direction of the resurrection of Jesus. And then also scientific investigations of the miraculous with regard to the Catholic Church. So looking at miraculous claims from Lourdes and Fatima, the Eucharistic miracles. And he does a pretty darn good job in going through those investigations to show that we have sufficient amount of motives of credibility with regard to miracles, such that not only an assent to Jesus Christ would be reasonable, but assent to the Catholic Church being the church established by Jesus and having that supernatural origin being reasonable as well.
Yeah, I spoke too soon. I didn't know that Father Spitzer was working on that project, so I definitely am looking forward to that. All right, well, let's try and be fair, because there's obviously a lot of objections to the papacy, and your book addresses sort of the responses from the skeptical or the Protestant standpoint, and I want to get into a few of those. Here's one I just want to get your thoughts on in general, because it's a common one, and if we're talking about like degrees of expectation, I think it is fair initially for a non-Catholic to say, well, hey, if there's this papacy, this is the general just bad popes objection, right? And you
Yeah.
already mentioned this and brought it up. Like, wouldn't we expect the popes to just be either of better moral character than many of them have been, or to be morally impeccable? And if this is the case, I mean, given the frankly undeniable fact we've had some real scoundrel leaders in the church, even at the level of the papacy, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that evidence against Catholicism? Maybe it's not decisive, but maybe we're just putting weights in a scale here. So so what do you think, Karlo? Is that a pebble in the scale? Is it a boulder? Or is it nothing at all? Is that a false expectation? How do you like to handle the bad popes objection?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's possible that Jesus could have willed to preserve Peter and all of his successors from sin, like he willed to preserve the Blessed Virgin Mary, as we claim. It's possible he could have done that, but in fact, he didn't do that. Should we expect Jesus to do that? Well, I'm not quite so sure that would be an expectation because, Jesus is, I would argue, perhaps a more plausible explanation, we touched on this before, is permitting the moral defect of the leaders of his church for the sake of showing the supernatural origin of his church, such that his church still existing to this day, despite the moral defects of the leaders of his church throughout so many years. And then further, think about this. The Catholic claim is that Christ does supernaturally preserve the teaching, the definitive teaching of his church, as voiced and given voice to through the magisterium, the living teaching authority of the church. So Christ does preserve that, but perhaps we could say that his permission of the moral defect would be evidence for the fact that he is preserving the definitive teaching. Because when you take into consideration just how bad some of the popes were, and it'd be reasonable to think that given their moral defects, that they would mess up the definitive teaching. They would screw up the teaching, right? Like they would be inclined to do that.
They would have incentive to do so, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, that they did not reverse definitive teaching or definitively declare something to be erroneous, which we already knew to be erroneous, is a testimony to a motive of credibility to assent to the proposition that the Catholic Church is the church established by Jesus Christ and therefore has supernatural origin. So rather than the moral defects of our leaders being evidence against the supernatural origin of the Catholic Church, I think we can turn the tables and say, in fact, that it could serve as evidence for it. And that even within God's providential plan, we see a good that God intends to bring about from a permitted defect. The good being motives of credibility for the church being established by Jesus, the permitted defect being the moral defect and character of many of our leaders.
Right, which is in accord, of course, with governing fallible human beings, which the Pope, qua human being, is, right?
Right. Yeah, and I wouldn't want to push that line of thinking too hard, because somebody could come back and say, well, if God's going to relate to us according to our nature and we want to push that too far, then why does God preserve the popes from error in definitive teaching, i.e. infallibility? Wouldn't that be over and above the nature of these fallible human beings? And yes, it is. So where God does preserve his leaders in one sense, namely freedom from error in teaching, he doesn't preserve in another sense, namely moral moral uprightness, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's a matter of offering an intelligible possible reason,
a special reason for exception, which links back to Mary, right? There are deeper theological reasons, such as the Mother of God, of why she might receive graces that in the general run, the rest of us wouldn't, right? So I think of these as principled exceptions. And when we think about the necessity of keeping revelation on the rails, we have a principled.
There you go. And that's the point I was going to bring up, that in God's providential plan, there's a certain telos, goal or end, that makes intelligible what we call infallibility. Given the goal, the telos, and the end of preserving the divine revelation that he reveals through his son, Jesus Christ, that brings up the need for preserving the teaching by way of infallibility, which moral uprightness does not come into play, is not a need or a condition for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can have moral defect and at the same time achieve the goal of preserving truth of the divine revelation
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
authentic interpretation. So
Yeah.
given the goal in the providential plan of preserving divine revelation, there's infallibility, which moral uprightness has no essential connection to.
Yeah. Now, I just want to emphasize again, because I think sometimes people get, I guess, a little too excited or defensive about some things. So when you're looking at different theories and paradigms, it's okay to admit that something, at least upon superficial inspection, might seem to point against the paradigm that you hold, right?
Right.
So take the problem of evil, right? I think upon substantial inspection, the problem of evil does not evidentially point away from the existence of God. But even if you disagree with that, maybe you take Swinburne's view, he thinks it does. He's willing to grant, hey, I think the problem of evil counts against the existence of God. It's a weight in the scale for atheism, say, but he just thinks that there's so much weight on the other side of the scale that it's not just rational, but you should believe in the existence of God, right? So I just want to say, like, it's okay to admit that stuff, and maybe somebody actually still has this intuition. Yeah, maybe I would expect moral impeccability of popes, even though that isn't a Catholic claim. It's not a Catholic claim, right? So the Catholic Church isn't predicting that, but maybe you would expect that anyways. Okay, put a weight in the scale against Catholicism, but then consider everything else that we've said and see if that doesn't, like, I'm saying, like, even if you granted that, it still seems like there's so much else on the other side that it shouldn't be that much of a concern. Now, it's a concern in a sense that, like, we don't like scandal ever. Like, it's always a horrible, bad thing, but just from a philosophical paradigm comparison perspective. Sure. You see what I'm saying, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. You know, if I am watching TV at night and the lottery number is the number on my ticket, I have some reason to think that it might be true, but I might be a bit skeptical, right? Or if you come and you tell me, hey, Karlo, you won the lottery. And then I'm like, well, I don't know about that, right? So given that information, your testimony alone, I might not be persuaded. But if I go and read it in the newspaper, I look online, and I have all these various sets of evidence that are confirming the one hypothesis that I won the lottery, well, then I would be moved rationally to assent to the proposition, I have won the lottery. And so I think initially, when you consider, say, the problem of evil, just considered in and of itself, it might tip the scale in favor of atheism, right? But once you start analyzing what evil is and how it's parasitic on goodness and existence, and you look at the metaphysical demonstrations for God's existence, well, then that tail is going to tip, because you're now looking at the problem of evil, not just isolated in a vacuum in and of itself, but within the context of the whole of all of the other data points and sets of evidence. And so I think you're spot on there. Yeah.
Yeah, just trying to make sure that people, it's easy to kind of like zoom in on one particular thing and lose a wider perspective.
Yeah.
And also just like trying to get people to chill out a little bit too, you know, just like, so that people get so like, you know, like the bad popes thing is like, it's an interesting objection. I'm with you in the ultimate analysis of it. I don't think that that's a right expectation. I don't think it is an evidential weight against the Catholic paradigm. However, I wouldn't be like super, that isn't a hill I would die on to try and get that weight completely removed, right? Like I think I could allow that weight for most people and say, well, look at all the other weights, right?
Right.
If that makes sense. So part of this is just, I guess, like practical considerations.
Sure.
Right?
But I think like if you take the line of thinking that I was articulating earlier, where you turn the table and actually see that moral defect, it actually, the nugget is taken from that side of the scale, and actually that very same nugget is put on the other side of the scale, because where it now becomes evidence in favor of the Catholic claim rather than it being evidence against the Catholic claim. So initially, you might think it's on this side of the scale weighing against the Catholic claim, but upon further analysis, you actually transfer the nugget or the weight to the other side of the scale, and it actually becomes evidence in favor
Right.
of.
And so much of this is, it's basic hypothesis testing, right? So like A can't count against a hypothesis unless the hypothesis really predicts not A, right?
Right.
So a lot of this is going to come down, well, does Catholicism predict no bad popes, right?
And no, it does not.
And if not, then it's hard to push that evidential consideration.
And at least even from a Christian perspective, at least from one who asserts to be a Christian and not a Catholic Christian, they wouldn't want to, the moral defect cannot be an issue, because if it were, one would have to reject Jesus. And no Christian's going to want to do that, right? Because Jesus's initial leaders, one of the initial 12, was a really bad dude, right? I mean, he actually betrayed our Lord himself. But yet that permitted moral defect at least from a Christian point of view, does not serve as evidence against Jesus. So we as a Catholic, we just take that principle one step further and say, just as the permitted moral defect in Judas is not evidence against Jesus's claims, so too the moral defects of leaders or popes of the Catholic Church does not count as evidence against the Catholic claim.
Right. Yeah. Very good. Okay. So give us a teaser from your book, Karlo. Throw something else out there. What's another objection? Since we're focusing on the papacy, let's just stay there. What's another objection that we haven't brought up, and how would you handle it? Give us a little teaser. Your book.
So I'll do this really quick because I'm running out of time here, running up to our time break. So for example, one common comeback is, well, the Catholic claim that Peter is the rock or the foundation upon which Jesus builds its church. That cannot be Peter, because elsewhere in the New Testament, we read in Bible passages where it talks about Jesus being the foundation of his church. And I think this ties into kind of what we're talking about a little bit here with philosophizing within Catholicism, because just because a metaphor is used in one way, it doesn't follow from that it cannot be used in another way, right? So here's where we're employing philosophy in order to analyze these texts. So it is true that in some passages, Jesus is referred to as the foundation of the church. 1 Corinthians 3:11 talks about this. St. Paul writes about Jesus being the foundation in his letter to the Ephesians. He's actually talking about the apostles being the foundation. But let's just stick with Jesus. And 1 Corinthians 3:11, he is the foundation of the church. But it doesn't follow from that Peter cannot be the foundation of the church, because he can be the foundation of Jesus's church in a different way. So Jesus is ultimately, we would say, the ultimate ground and foundation of the church that he's building, of course, because it's his church. But he constitutes Peter as a visible foundation of his church here on earth, because, of course, the Christian claim is that Jesus is no longer visibly present with us because he ascended into heaven. And so the claim is that he constitutes Peter to be his visible representative, a delegated rockness, you might say, to be a delegated foundation of his church here on earth, to map on and comport with our human nature, that we need a visible principle and source of unity. And so there's the philosophizing again.
And just before I forget, like, that works really nicely, I think, generally with a participation metaphysics. If you also got that in the background, right? Yeah, sorry, continue.
Absolutely. God is the source of being itself, pure esse, ipsum esse subsistens. We have esse, finite modes of esse, derived from God. But nevertheless, we affirm I exist in an analogous way to affirming God exists. So too with Peter's rockness. We can affirm Peter is rock, Peter is foundation, without in any way taking away from the uniqueness of Jesus being the foundation, because Jesus ultimately is the source of the church itself. But Peter serves as a foundation in a derivative way, in a participatory way. And so absolutely, Pat, the prior metaphysics of participated esse can illuminate how Peter can be the foundation of Jesus' church here on earth in a way that does not take away from Jesus being the true foundation of his church.
Yeah, really great. I know we're out of time. Sorry, I got a little greedy, but I love
That's
talking to
all right, man.
Karlo. So tell us about your new book and mention, where can people get it? What can people
Sure.
expect from it? And any of your other books you want to mention, please just put it all out there, right?
Yeah, so the new book is Meeting the Protestant Response, How to Answer Common Comebacks to Catholic Arguments. I basically go through the classic Catholic arguments that we've formulated in support of our beliefs, looking at certain Bible passages that we've traditionally appealed to, and answering the question, what do Protestant apologists say in response to those arguments? Why don't they buy the argument? Why are they still Protestant in the face of these Catholic arguments?
That's good. So you're more forward in the conversation. Right. Yeah.
So I'm answering that question. How do they alternatively read these texts? So I give them their voice, and then I engage with their responses and ultimately show, in my view, that they do not succeed in refuting the Catholic argument. And so the Catholic argument remains standing and strong. And so that's basically what I do in that book, Meeting the Protestant Response. Your viewers, if they're interested, can get a copy at shop.catholic.com, and they can follow my work at catholic.com. All of the work I do is there.
Awesome. We will link that in the show notes. I know we have lots of people who tune into philosophy, people who are very interested in apologetics. So this book is going to be perfect for them. So please check it out. Support Karlo and the good work he is doing. And Catholic Answers generally, of course, have a very good relationship with them. Wonderful, wonderful work in general. Of course, I'm biased. I'm working for him, right? Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. Yeah, everyone already knows that. That's no secret. So, yeah, check it out. Karlo, always a pleasure chatting with you, my friend. Thanks for coming on. Let's do it again soon, man. Yep.
All right, indeed. Take